Hello everyone, this is George Buscemi from Campagne Québec-Vie, and this is Culture of Life. So first news item from Quebec. Quebec court decision supports trend towards unrestricted euthanasia. And this is a press release from the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. So the Quebec Superior Court in Truchon versus Canada, it's a case that was recently decided, rendered as a decision that continues the trend toward unrestricted euthanasia. The court found that the requirement that natural death be reasonably foreseeable, which was what the law said in Quebec, that for people to get medical aid in dying or euthanasia, their death had to be reasonably foreseeable. Well, that requirement is now unconstitutional. So the decision represents a fundamental attack on Canadian values, says the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. And it's a danger to all people. It is a threat to the lives of all Canadians. So they say that 95% of the countries around the world still outlaw euthanasia. So this is bad news coming out of Quebec. And it will have, as a result, the effect of creating euthanasia on demand in Quebec within the foreseeable future. And the reason is that whereas until very recently, until this decision, euthanasia was for when death was imminent and the person was under a great amount of pain, and so they decided that, well, we'll allow it for these cases in Quebec, we'll allow it for these cases where, death is foreseeable. And now people protested, given the Canadian Supreme Court decision, this recent Canadian Supreme Court decision that allowed euthanasia. They decided to contest the Quebec law, which came before the Supreme Court decision, and said, well, this restriction to foreseeable death is unconstitutional. I am in pain. Even though my death is not foreseeable, I'm still going to live a while. This situation is intolerable, therefore I should be able to kill myself or have the doctor kill me. And now in this decision, Truchon versus Canada, they're going to allow this. So what's to stop anybody else now from saying, I have intolerable pain, whether psychological, physical, or other, and you cannot judge the level of pain that I feel, therefore just give me euthanasia. And so we're going to be having euthanasia on demand anytime now in Canada. And the only way to reverse it, as in the case of abortion, which began with a very restrictive law where you had to go through a panel of doctors and get it approved for medically necessary reasons, that finally got totally destroyed with the Morgentaler decision of 1988, which created abortion on demand. Well, to get abortion gotten rid of, you have to just say, from the moment of conception, we deal with a human being that's innocent, and so putting them to death should be illegal. And in the same way, to get rid of euthanasia, you just have to say, these people are innocent human beings. It cannot be allowed to kill them because that's just what we do as a society, as a civilization. We respect human life from conception to natural death, and it is illicit to kill an innocent human being, period. And that's the only way you can get rid of euthanasia, and that's the only way you can get rid of abortion. It's to just be clear on the parameters. Otherwise, the line, whether you draw it when the person is very sick or when the person is in pain, wherever you draw it, it's arbitrary, and people will get rid of that line and introduce murder on demand, whether at the beginning of life or at the end of life. And pretty soon, any place in between. Our lives will be in danger because we've introduced a government mandate, a government permission to kill human beings. So we've allowed it at the end of life, we've allowed it at the start, and anywhere in the middle, if somebody wants to euthanize themselves. In parts of Europe, people have been euthanized for heartbreak, meaning the person is broken up with their boyfriend and she couldn't live with that distress, for eating disorders, for chronic mental health issues, other chronic mental health issues, euthanasia has been granted on these grounds. So basically, we have euthanasia on demand in the West. And so now, life and death is in the hands of the government, and that's not a good place to be. That's a totalitarian place to be, and we have to fight it. Next up, bodies of over 2,000 unborn babies found on dead abortionists' property. This is news coming out of LifeSite News. The bodies of 2,246 aborted babies were found in the home of a recently deceased abortionist who previously operated in Pete Buttigieg, South Bend, Indiana city. So in South Bend, Indiana, this is where Pete Buttigieg, Democratic candidate for the 2020 presidential elections, that's where he's situated, and this abortionist was situated there as well. The abortionist's name is Dr. Ulrich Klopfer, and he had a women's pavilion in South Bend, Indiana, where he committed most of his abortions. And he lost his medical license in 2016, and then he passed away recently. So they went to his home and they found the bodies of 2,246 aborted babies. Now, it's not clear why he had all these little babies stored at his home. They were in some kind of medical containers. It's possible that he had committed abortions in other states and did not want to be caught, so brought them back home. We have no idea, as it is, why he hid those bodies at his home. He has been known to have a history of abuses. For example, he has hidden the statutory rape of a couple of his clients. A 13-year-old and a 10-year-old were admitted to his clinic and were the victims of rape. One was the victim of incest, and he granted the abortion without declaring the crime to police because the parents didn't want it to be known, obviously. This is often remarked by pro-lifers. The fact that abortion often is used to hide crime, hide rape. The only way you can really get rid of all the evidence of a rape, especially if the rape yields a child, is to get rid of the child. That way the DNA sample can't be taken from the child and can't be traced back to the criminal father. So rape is often hidden by abortion, and we see it here with this statutory rape. Twice this abortionist was caught hiding statutory rape from the police. Next news item, Canadian pro-life champion Mary Wagner convicted of mischief for defending babies. So this is news out of Vancouver, where Mary Wagner currently resides, and it's out of LifeSite News. Canadian human rights defender Mary Wagner was convicted of trespassing and interference with the operation of a business following months in jail after she entered a Vancouver abortion facility to inform expectant mothers about alternatives to abortion. This is something Mary Wagner has been doing for much of her adult life. She is a 40-something Catholic woman who, what she does is that she goes into abortion clinics, Toronto, Vancouver, and comes with a rose and gives the rose to the women waiting to get an abortion. And there's a note sometimes tied to the rose, and she tells them about alternatives to abortion. She tells them about Jesus. She tells them about the baby in the woman's womb. And very quickly, the abortionists call the police and haul her away. And she has spent close to 5 years of her life in jail at this point. So she's been doing this off and on, and for the last 7 or so Christmases, she has spent them in jail. So in a statement on Facebook, Wagner said, "This conviction is nothing I am ashamed of. On the contrary, I am pleased that the court has found there is enough evidence to conclude that I interfered with the business of destroying helpless unborn children who remain unprotected and abandoned by the courts." And that's a beautiful thing to say, because she's proud to have put a stop to even like one abortion, just to kind of put some kind of stick in the spokes of this machine. And she'll be able to at the end of her life, when she gets judged in a particular judgment by Jesus Christ, she'll be able to say, look at all the stuff I did. I at least tried to save a few unborn babies, and that'll count as a lot. And she has evidence. It's written down in court papers that she's done this. And how many people have that honor of being able, of having such clear evidence that they are Catholic, that they are allies and brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ? That's how you do it. And so, fantastic news for Mary Wagner. And every one of those years she spent in jail is that many less years in purgatory for her. So it's wonderful news. Next up, Archbishop Vigano. We are witnessing the creation of a new church, quote unquote. So this is out of LifeSite News. It's from September 13th. And Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, who was known in 2018 for his blockbuster letter of accusation against Pope Francis and the upper hierarchy for hiding the abuse by Theodore McCarrick, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, now ex-cardinal and ex-priest because he's been defrocked. He was penalized by Benedict XVI because it was known that he was that he engaged in sexual relations with seminarians and others, same-sex relations, and it was known that he was up to no good. And so Benedict XVI told him, cool your heels, stop traveling, just stay put, you're in the doghouse. And as soon as Benedict was mysteriously abdicated, McCarrick was rehabilitated immediately. He began making trips to China to talk to the communists over there to broker the communist Vatican deal. He went to Cuba. He had all sorts of trips lined up, and he boasted about it. And so he was rehabilitated, even though he was under a kind of suspension, a kind of penalty by Benedict XVI for his bad behavior. And Vigano accused Pope Francis of looking the other way and even of rehabilitating McCarrick. And finally, there was a very strong and credible accusation against McCarrick, which forced Pope Francis's hand and caused the laicization or the defrocking of now ex-Cardinal McCarrick. But now this same Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano is now hiding out. He's now on the run. Not only because he got in trouble with this, but because he used to run the Vatican City State and run the financial affairs of the Vatican City State back before he was nuncio at the United States. So he was the Vatican ambassador for the United States for a while. And before that, he was in charge of the finances of the Vatican City State, right under the Secretariat of State. And so it was running at the time, officially, a deficit of 10 million euros per year. And he had discovered that there were about 50 million euros in hidden or occult bank accounts. So he actually saw that there was a 40 million euro surplus per year. And after he had discovered this, he got thanked and he had to go and he became nuncio at the United States. But having seen this information sometimes is not good for your bodily integrity. And so this is probably one of the reasons why he's hiding now. He was interviewed by Robert Moynihan because they have a friendship going back many years, apparently. And so to trusted people, he discloses his location, and he drops this information once in a while. So the latest information he has dropped is that he sincerely believes that the Catholic Church has been infiltrated, and that this infiltration goes back centuries. And so he says it starts, in particular, in the middle of the 1700s with Freemasonry. So Freemasonry was founded in London in 1717. But of course, this project was very deceptive and oriented, even included in some way the forces of some members of the church. So there were inside traitors that collaborated with Freemasonry. So this is described, Vigano says, in the book Infiltration by Taylor Marshall. So you may find some indication of this process there. But this process became strikingly evident in modern times. So this is an amazing statement by Vigano. He actually name drops Dr. Taylor Marshall, who has just written a book entitled Infiltration. And I recommend this book. I've just downloaded it. I've had it on my phone for quite a while, for a few months now. It came out earlier this year, but I'm rereading it now. And it's really, really impressive. It's a tour de force of, I guess, modern church history. It starts at the beginning of the 18th century. And it details the infiltration of the Catholic Church by Masonic thinking and communism, which leads us up to this day. And basically, Vigano is giving his stamp of approval to this book. And Vigano is not a nobody. He's actually a major, high-ranking prelate. He's a major whistleblower, and if the media wasn't so left-leaning, they would be interviewing this guy day after day after day. But because he's not in accord with the powers and principalities and not in accord with the powerful of this world, they totally ignore him or mention him a bit just to discredit him. So I recommend that if you have a strong stomach and a strong faith life, to read this book, just so that you could be more useful in your defense of the church. Read the book Infiltration by Dr. Taylor Marshall. Next up now, pro-contraception priest hired to teach ethics at the new John Paul II Institute in Rome. So this is news out of LifeSite News. A notorious clerical proponent of artificial contraception and homosexual unions has officially been hired to teach at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute in Rome. So this, they at LifeSite, they verified the course list for 2019-2020 of this institute, and they saw that Father Maurizio Chiotti will teach a course on theological ethics of life, and also a seminar called Conscience and Discernment about Chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. So to put this all into context, Amoris Laetitia was published, I believe, in 2016, in March, on the Feast of St. Joseph, March 19th. And Amoris Laetitia, by all accounts, seems to have upended two of John Paul II's major documents. So it contradicts two things that John Paul II was very adamant about. The first thing that John Paul II was adamant about was refusing communion for divorced and remarried people. The reason why is that the divorced and remarried people whose marriages are valid, they cannot be admitted to communion because they're in the state of mortal sin, because they're having sex with somebody who's not their spouse. So when you're in a state of mortal sin, it's bad for you to have communion because you're lying to God. You're saying, I'm in communion with you, Jesus, while being in mortal sin. So the church has always refused communion to people who are manifestly in a state of mortal sin because they have to fix their situation. They have to go to confession and say, I won't do this anymore. I will not have sex with somebody who is not my wife or husband. And then I'll go to communion. And I promise not to go back into that sin. And even if you do go back to that sin, if you confess again and you promise not to go back, you can get communion. And communion will be profitable for you. That was what John Paul II taught in Familiaris Consortio, an exhortation of his about the family. Another thing that John Paul II wrote is about the intrinsic evils, meaning about how some sins are always bad no matter the circumstances. And so he wrote, in veritatis splendor, there are some things that are bad no matter the circumstances, and nothing can excuse doing these things. They're always going to be sins. And Amoris Laetitia in chapter 8, paragraph 303 and around, to be precise, seems to contradict this, seems to say that, well, whatever it is that you are doing, your conscience sometimes can tell you that in those circumstances it's okay and God approves, because it depends on the circumstances. So that we have an instance of situation ethics, and John Paul II wanted to crush this idea of situation ethics with veritatis splendor. And so now we have a back door opening to all sins. None of the Decalogue sins, none of the Ten Commandments now are always valid. It depends on the circumstances now. It's up for grabs. And so for now, we're limiting this up for grabedness to sins of the flesh like contraception and sodomy and things like that. But I see this coming from a mile away. Soon abortion will be like this, where if a 14-year-old gets pregnant via rape, well, you know, God allows you to have an abortion this time. Some priests will say, because Amoris Laetitia says your conscience can discern that sometimes, depending on the circumstances, things that are normally evil might not be. And so what we have with Amoris Laetitia is complete moral relativism, situation ethics, and the institutions that John Paul II has founded to defend his absolutist moral norms, well, now they're being dismantled by Pope Francis to allow for this moral relativism. So the Pontifical Academy for Life, all the pro-lifers who are hardcore got kicked out of there, and that academy has now been gutted. And now this, the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family, that had a lot of pro-lifers, that had a lot of teachings which were in accord with Familiaris Consortio and Veritatis Splendor, so the prohibition of sin, no matter the circumstances. And now that's being gutted today. And people like Maurizio Chiotti are being allowed in, and they're allowed to spread their moral relativism and their poison. And this is hugely worrying. And we just have to hope and pray that God lifts this scourge from the church. Next news item, Alberta government wants all public funded colleges and universities to adopt the Chicago principles. So this is good news coming out of Alberta, with Jason Kenney being elected as Premier of Alberta for the Conservative Party, the United Conservative Party of Alberta. Things are changing for the better, and we're seeing it with this policy from the Albertan government obliging publicly funded universities to safeguard free speech on their campuses. So the Fort McMurray Keyano College is the first post-secondary institution in the province to adopt those Chicago principles, and all universities have to do it by December 15, 2019. Now, what are these Chicago principles? Well, they're a set of guidelines drawn up by the University of Chicago a few years back in reaction to the suppression of free speech in a lot of left-wing colleges and universities. So there's a kind of trendy suppression of free speech done by the left on colleges, safe spaces, trigger warnings. Universities are becoming these kind of padded pink daycare centers, and nothing can be said that would harm even remotely the feelings of anybody. So it's almost impossible to discuss anything of consequence on university campuses today. And so to free up university space to allow discussion to happen again, people like Jason Kenney and Doug Ford are in Ontario are saying to universities, if you guys want to keep your funding, your public funding, you have to allow free speech. You have to allow people to be pro-life and to have pro-life groups, because the restrictions are often always against Christians, pro-lifers, and conservatives who advocate for free speech or who advocate for traditional marriage or against special pronouns for gender-confused people. So it's great news that this is happening, and I hope it spreads everywhere, including in Quebec, where there's also a lot of limits on free speech due to left socialistic activism. Next news item out of the UK, gender-neutral uniform sparks protest at Lewes Priory School. So there was about 150 parents and pupils that staged a protest outside a secondary school over gender-neutral uniforms. So this particular private school was very zealous in its political correctness and its desire to be very inclusive towards gender-confused people and LGBT people. So they said, well, these skirts that the girls wear trigger and are very hurtful to gender-confused people, make them feel excluded. So what we want is that everyone wear the same thing, everyone wear the pants and the shirt, so that no one feels like different. And a lot of people found that over the line, overboard, and stupid. And so they protested. And it's gone around the world that these girls are just saying, we want to wear skirts. And they even, when they tried to get in the school with their skirts, they were stopped by police. They were turned away by a bunch of policemen for trying to get into their school wearing a skirt. So this is the state of the world today. We don't want girls to look like girls. We just want everybody to be like a cube of meat. I think that, in about 10 years' time, we'll do to humans what they do to chicken today, is that they kind of produce these cubic chickens that are stuffed with hormones, and they all look the same, and they don't even look chicken-like anymore. Well, they'll want to do that with humans so that we can all be equal, and so that nobody can make anybody else feel bad, because we'll all be equally subhuman and stupid and manipulable by the New World Order. So I'm glad to see a little bit of pushback from these students and parents who are pushing back against ridiculous political correctness. Next news item, doctor in South Africa faces charges of unprofessional conduct after stating a fetus is a human. So this is according to Sowetan Live. Dr. Jacques DeVos allegedly told a patient that a fetus is a human and claimed that abortion kills a human. And after this, his employment was terminated and he was prohibited from practicing medicine. He's facing 4 charges of unprofessional conduct from the Health Professions Council of South Africa. And according to the report, DeVos allegedly infringed the patient's autonomy with his anti-abortion utterances. So here you have a common thread in this social justice, political correctness inquisition we see all over the world, is that when you say something true, you are now hateful. When you say something based on a fact, you are hateful. Why? Because you are challenging that person's version of reality, and there's a supposed right for each person to have their view of reality validated. So, for example, if I am a man with a penis, but my reality is that I'm a woman, if you tell me I'm a man, you are hateful and you should go to prison. Or if you are a gay man and you think that marriage exists between 2 men, that it's possible to marry 2 men, if you tell me that that is not a metaphysical possibility, that it is impossible by definition, then you're hateful. and you should go to prison or you should lose your job. And so we see more and more the idea that people have a right to their own worldview, their own reality, and if you contest that in any way, if you challenge it, you are denying their right to entertain their own view of the world. Well, this is, of course, an intolerable situation. You cannot pretend that each person has a right to their own view of reality. They have a right to express what they think is reality. They may say, I think reality is X, but it doesn't mean they have a right to that reality, that they can't be refuted or countered. That's how things should work, is that you may have a differing opinion about what reality is, but I should be able to challenge it. I should be able to say, no, that's wrong. And there should be a fact of the matter that we can point at. And normally biology is that fact of the matter. If you say you're a woman, but then you've got gonads and a penis dangling between your legs, then I should be able to say, you see, that fact refutes your allegation that you're a woman. But no, they don't accept that. They say, no, I have a right to think that I'm a woman, even though I have the biology of a man, I have the voice of the man, et cetera, et cetera. So we're now going into a kind of a bizarro world where we're enforcing relativism. Moral relativism, for sure. Each has a right to their own morality, but even more, it's like scientific relativism. Each has a right to their own scientific reality. So this is just insanity, and this is just a way of, I don't know, creating crazy people, a population of people who are completely disconnected from the world and are completely, I guess, compliant with whatever the world powers want that person to believe, as long as they can be maintained in their cocoon and their autistic isolation. So anyways, this instance of a doctor being suspended for pointing out the truth and suggesting it as a breach of that of his patient's autonomy is another step in a direction of complete relativism being promoted. And relativism is just a destructor, a way to destroy society. To have a society, you have to have a moral code. If each person can have their own moral code, then that's anarchy. Next up, Bernie Sanders says U.S. must fund abortions overseas in poor countries to curb the population and to save the planet. Now, this is out of the Christian Post. So presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders, he railed against the Trump administration for ending U.S. funding of abortion overseas and said one of the benefits of abortion is that it reduces the population. Sanders, senator from Vermont, was on a CNN town hall, and he was answering a question posed by Martha Redioff, who's a teacher, and she said that, well, you know, the planet cannot sustain the growth of the population, and so what are we going to do about it? Bernie Sanders, do you agree that contraception and reproductive health and abortion is a way of dealing with this problem? And he agreed that it was, and that these things had to be financed and promoted overseas. This is something that the Democrats do every time they take power, is that they eliminate or they reverse the Mexico City policy. It's a U.S. policy that stipulates that none of their foreign aid can be used to promote abortion. And so when Trump came to power, he reenacted this Mexico City policy, and so their money cannot be used to promote abortion. And every time the Democrats come in, Hillary Clinton would have done this, is that they then get rid of that policy and they start financing organizations, Planned Parenthood International, Mary Stopes International, all these organizations that promote abortion overseas and try to get laws overturned in third world countries. And so obviously Bernie Sanders, being to the left of the left, agrees with this, and so they genuinely think that abortion should be promoted overseas, and I guess he's being consistent because he wants it to be promoted in the U.S. as well. He sees it as a good thing. And finally, in Northern Ireland, pro-life Northern Ireland has its say. So you may not have heard of this if you've watched only mainstream media in the last few weeks, but there was a huge pro-life rally in Northern Ireland. About 20,000 people were reported to have attended, and this was in reaction to a kind of maneuver by the British Parliament. Because Northern Ireland doesn't have a government in place at the moment, and in light of the fact that the Republic of Ireland has recently had a pro-abortion legislation put in, they had a vote recently, and they allowed abortion in the Republic of Ireland. So now the southern part of Ireland allows abortion. So the northern part is still pro-life on paper, but they've been having trouble electing representatives to their parliament, and Great Britain took advantage of that situation to say, if you don't have people in by such a date in October, you will have to allow abortion. And so it's another way of just taking advantage of this strange compromising situation they're in Northern Ireland to put in abortion while the south part has just allowed it through a referendum. So now the pro-lifers of Northern Ireland met en masse in front of the Parliament to show that Northern Ireland is still pro-life, that there's still a lot of pro-life people in Northern Ireland. But of course, no media has talked about it. No mainstream media has talked about it. All they talk about, actually, and we verified a few sites, are the counter rallies to this pro-life rally. So they'll talk about the handful of people who have showed up to protest the pro-life rally, but they won't talk about the pro-life rally itself. So bravo to those protesters who showed up in front of the Parliament. And these are great crowds, and it's a well-organized rally, so bravo. So that's the news for this week. Hope to see you next week. Don't forget to like this video and to share it around on Facebook and on YouTube. And until then, God bless.